Hello and welcome back to A Shark's Perspective. I had the pleasure of speaking at a new conference for their inaugural event, Lead Generation World. They also asked me to podcast live from the halls, so I'll be releasing 4 shows that were recorded there. It's always interesting to me as a speaker and keynote to see who conferences pick as their opening keynote, especially for a brand new event, since that can really set the tone, and they did extremely well with their choice. Jeff Kreisler is a best-selling author, the editor-in-chief of PeopleScience.com, a site devoted to leading the conversation about applied behavioral insights, and he's a former stand-up comedian and performer. And on this episode, we'll discuss behavioral science, stand-up comedy, the Did You Ever Notice observations of Seinfeld, decision traps, human nature, Princeton, law school, the pain of paying, Jim Cramer in the street, and a lot more. So let's tune in to part 1 of Lead Generation World's opening keynote speaker with your favorite keynote shark on this episode of A Shark's Perspective. So, Jeff, thank you so much for joining us on A Shark's Perspective live at Lead Generation World. Tell us about your background and your career to date.
Thanks for having me on, Kenneth the Shark. I feel like I should place bets for the Super Bowl with you. So my background is pretty typical. After studying politics and Russian studies at Princeton, I went to law school and then became a stand-up comedian.
Yeah, natural.
Because how else would you change the world? There are steps in the middle there, including being a youngest child and a lot of emotional baggage. But through stand-up, I focused on sort of politics, and then I got an opportunity to write about business, and it ultimately became about why people are often led astray and don't do things in their best interests. I know that sounds hilarious on the surface, but that's a 30,000-foot view of it, exactly. And I got an opportunity to write a humor column for Jim Cramer's TheStreet.com.
Yeah.
And it was about business and finance. A friend of mine was at the site, said, "You want to write a column on weekly business?" I said, "No." He said, "It pays." I said, "Yes." So it was simple. Through that, I got an opportunity to write my first book, which was sort of a publishing company gave me sort of carte blanche. Is that how you say it? Blank? Anyway, they said, "What do you want to write on?" I wrote a book called Get Rich Cheating, which is a satire, and it was about steroids and Enron, and our president was in there, and basically how people sort of flaunt the rules, scam, get their way to the top, and also why people make poor decisions with their money and are fooled by these things. Through that, I then met this guy, Dan Ariely, who's author of a book called Predictably Irrational. He's a professor at Duke. He's one of the leading thinkers in the field of behavioral economics. He invited me to talk about cheating at his class in Duke. I talked about it in character, and I basically told Duke graduate students that they should cheat because cost-benefit analysis, no one gets caught, benefit is millions. And anyway, I'm making a long story short, but through that I was introduced to Dan's work and the field of behavioral science, and it was a light bulb moment for me because I had sort of had, in all of the things I'd learned and all the work I'd done, had this sense of basically money messes with our heads and makes us do stupid, irrational things, and then I discovered there was a field of science dedicated to researching that. Dan and I worked on a few projects, and then in 2017, the end of 2017, we put out a book called Dollars and Cents, which was all about financial decision-making, behavioral science, the emotions, why we make the dumb, irrational decisions we do, and how to do better. It was fascinating. So it kind of gave myself a crash PhD in the field, or maybe a master's. And through that, then I'm getting
an online PhD.
Yeah, exactly. Well, some of it was in person, but it was definitely not structured like normal. But I studied the field, and as the publication was approaching, I wanted to figure out how I could continue sort of evangelicalizing for this field as a tool for helping people. Not the silver bullet, but one tool in the toolkit for solving people's personal, professional, organizational, even societal ills. And I got an opportunity to run PeopleScience.com, which is my main thing right now. It's a website dedicated to the future of applied behavioral science, how this field can impact financial decision-making, healthcare, design, loyalty, motivation, ethics, and it's been a real joy, and so I do that now, and I also go and I speak to organizations and conferences about this field that's growing and booming, and depending on your perspective is either emerging or has emerged.
Well, I had the pleasure of hearing you speak and drop a few good jokes in there this morning. Let's dive in a little bit further on your background in comedy.
Sure.
You know, what made you do it for a while and stay in it, and then what made you get out of it?
Putting aside the psychological motivators, what was fascinating to me about comedy was it was something where you could talk about any topic, and the only rules you had to be funny, where you could make topics and conversations that might seem difficult or uncomfortable easy by being funny, whether it was politics or money or even religion, whether it's in a comedy club or just around a dinner table. Using humor as a way to connect, and there's a whole little field of research on that. And I just found it so fascinating that, like The Daily Show is a classic example. People say that's where people got their news, but that you could, through being funny, bring people into a conversation that they might not otherwise join, and you could convey information they might not otherwise be ready to listen to. Excuse me. And as I reflect back on then the pivot to behavioral science, a comedian that Jerry Seinfeld, Larry David type says, "Hey, you ever notice people do this stupid thing?" And a behavioral scientist says, "Yeah, and this is why."
Yeah.
So there's a very yin-yang relationship, and I found in the field, comedians and behavioral scientists are both sort of that fly on the wall, observing human nature and sort of chuckling about the absurdity of it. The behavioral scientist is just a lot more focused on taking the data. The comedian just wants the joke and the free drink.
So as marketers and business leaders, how do we use human nature, because that's something you really spent a lot of good time on this morning, to benefit us with lead generation, sales, and all those good things?
It's a great question, and my philosophy is that we can't change human nature, but if we understand human nature, we understand what drives people to make the decisions they do, to purchase this item or click on that website or become loyal to this product. If we understand why they do that, the behavioral science, the underlying emotional drivers, psychological drivers, then we can create systems and environments and products and services and ways of communicating and marketing and interacting with folks that helps them get to better outcomes. Essentially, I like to say that if we understand human nature, why people are doing what they do, then we can go to where they are instead of fighting so hard to bring them to us. I think in so many fields, whether it's marketing or financial decision-making or healthcare decision-making, we bang our heads against the wall and say, why aren't people taking their medication? Why aren't people saving for retirement? Why aren't people clicking on this link? And we try to say, look at you, like you should do this. This is the thing, look, come on, it's obvious. And we try to convince them of our perspective, whereas if we understand their perspective, what's really driving them, whether it's a fear or whether it's, it's an easy decision or an uncertainty, then we can create a whole system for them that's going to fit them much better. We're going to become more advisors and salespeople, become close to them, build relationships and trust. And I think that it's a great, for the future of sort of any business, we have all the data, right? We know where people are looking on the screen, what they're clicking, we know their numbers, but then what does that translate to into real behavior? And that's where I think the science can help us make a future that's more designed for better outcomes.
Are you running into a lot of conversations today? I mean, because when you think of the person that followed you after your speech was talking about AI. So much of it's that intersection. I think behavioral science is setting it up to we know what we can do to help trigger people, but a lot of times it comes down to the conversation is AI so much better than what we do as reading people. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, AI is interesting, the relationship with behavioral science, and I don't think needs to be a conflict between the two. I think you approach AI, some might say it's a computer versus it's a human in behavioral science, but the AI is based upon human behavior.
Exactly.
I saw, a fascinating talk about it had to do with kids and how they drew, and the development of AI is based upon what behavior has been sort of observed. And there's a lot of talk about bias in AI comes out.
Oh, absolutely.
And it's because the programming is by human. It's based on human behavior. So I think that there's room for them to coexist, and I think really the future is for them to coexist so long as the people designing the AI or the data going into it or what they're drawing on has at least a moment where they recognize that human element, that uncertainty, that psychological drivers, and the fact that sort of what the mass of people are deciding today may change as they interact down the road, that we humans are sort of fickle. But AI is incredibly powerful. If you can capture what 60% of the people are going to do, that's a lot better than just guesswork. So there's I think a symbiotic is maybe not too strong a word, but there's a relationship between the two fields, I think, that should blossom.
So talk a little bit about the decision traps and the pain of paying relativity. I enjoyed that this morning.
Sure. Well, there's a ton of decision-making traps. The two I often think are most common are one called the pain of paying, which is this concept that when we pay for something, it stimulates the same region of our brain as physical pain. And what that should do is that should make us, when we feel this pain, pay attention and think, oh, is this the right decision? But what tends to happen as technology and things evolve is we numb that pain of paying. Right, like if you look at a spectrum, it goes, there's cash and writing checks and debit cards and credit cards on up to Easy Pass and automatic bill pay and Apple Pay and these things that, Apple Watch and blinking and you spend money. And so when that pain of paying is numbed, when that friction is reduced, we pay less attention to our decision and the decision becomes less thoughtful. This can be good or bad. I often approach things saying it's bad because we shouldn't overspend, but those things can be used for good. If people are reluctant to get insurance, which will benefit them long term, reducing the pain of paying can help them focus less on the payment and more on what they want to achieve as their goals, as a simple example. The other one that you mentioned is relativity, which is just, when we don't know what is the right choice, one thing we often do is we compare two options, even if they don't really compare. The example I often rely on is a sale price, right? A $100 sweater that's been marked down to $60, you're going to buy because you compare a $60 sweater to a $100 sweater that doesn't really exist, but you're like, oh, this is the right choice. It feels good, right? Emotionally, instead of having to figure out, oh, should I pay $60 for a sweater? You're like, well, I know 60 is less than 100, so yay, dopamine rush. And that relativity, that comparing things happens all the time. New products and services. Think about cell phone plans, right? When you buy a cell phone, there's all the features of the phone and there's all the plans, and it's a massive thing that's hard to compare, so we end up sort of coming back and comparing a price, right, as an easy substitute for what we really want. And this happens all the time because, again, we're these emotional creatures that in the absence of supreme knowledge of what the right choice is and what the future holds, we'll go for that emotional pat on the back that says, you did the right thing, which is the easy choice.
Well, I'm going to fudge the numbers, as you say, because I can't remember the exact example, but the one that I really enjoyed as well was we were talking about people not arguing over these $100,000 deals or something like $600,000, yet we'll spend a ridiculous amount of time arguing over 2 cents on something. I forget exactly what the example was, but kind of explain what you meant by that and that setup.
Well, oftentimes relativity in this particular sense comes into play in terms of percentages. Like we will think that, we're buying a house, right, for $600,000 with some work on it, and someone says, hey, you want this $5,000 built-in whatever. And for many reasons, we're sort of overwhelmed, but part of it in this case is $5,000 off of $600,000 seems like a tiny percent, right? It's less than 1%. Then we go to the supermarket, and in order to gain a sense of control over our lives, we see, organic tomatoes are 15 cents more per pound. Yeah. And that feels like a bigger deal, because in our mind, we're like, well, if we did that 10,000 times, it would add up to, still wouldn't add up to the 5,000. What just happens is we often focus on the small decisions as opposed to large ones. And when people ask me for advice regarding personal financial decision making, I often suggest that they flip that on the head. It's those big purchases, the houses, the college, the cars, the ones that feel so overwhelming and at some point you just want to get it over with, that you actually need to just keep on fighting and going through that discomfort and look, because those are the big amount. Think about the absolute dollars leaving your account. That's the ones you should stress about. The little ones, the $5 latte, the Susie Orman $5 latte, the organic tomatoes, don't stress those. Yeah. Think about it now and then, but that shouldn't be a daily stress. And just prioritize.
Well, they're doing all that math for the organic tomatoes on the $1,000 iPhone calculator app that they wasted their money on. Right. So, well, go into fairness and effort and how we should exhibit that. I was sort of really thinking about that, about how people pay based on when they think a company or person has expended a lot of effort on it. But how as marketers do you think we should apply that so that we can show customers it's worth the value we're spending on it?
Right. Yeah, well, people often judge the value of a product or service, or really just a decision, based upon what effort they see go into it. Again, in the absence of being supercomputers that know what something's worth, it's, what does it look like? The classic example is the locksmith. Right off the top of your head, can your listeners tell me what they should pay a locksmith? Mm-hmm. Probably not, unless they've been locked out a lot. Mm-hmm. But a locksmith that takes an hour to open your door and breaks locks and swears and sweats, people will pay that person more than one that opens a door in 2 minutes because they see that effort, when really you're paying for incompetence. But you see the effort. And study after study show when we see an effort, we will underestimate wait times, we'll overestimate value. And marketers, there's a fine line to walk, because you don't want to fake a display of effort that's gone into creating a product or creating an interface. People punish something they think of as unfair, but you do want to demonstrate the value of what you're offering. Otherwise, people will discount it, and they won't be as invested in the process that you're selling, the marketing process, or ultimately the decision. An example I often use as I speak to a lot of wealth advisors is, the wealth advisor, right, that charges their whatever management fee, their 1 or 2%. If people stop and think about it, that's absurd. All you're doing is, I don't see any effort. You have to really explain to them what their value is. I spent a little time as a lawyer. I went to law school, passed the bar, and didn't really practice. But the legal field has a real problem. They sort of charge hourly. That's been their short circuit around trying to show the value of essentially their knowledge, right? They went to school, they've got years of practice, but people don't see that value. People actually hate lawyers. So they charge an hourly fee, which in many ways is counterproductive, right? I'd rather have a lawyer that knows how to get me out of a parking ticket or do a corporate deal by their years of experience in 10 minutes than one that takes 4 hours. But the perverse incentives are there. I know I've wandered far off of the marketing question, but the point being, when people enter a transaction, whether it's a marketing transaction from an ad or a survey, or they're at the cash register thinking about paying, the effort that they believe has gone into creating that service or that process will influence how much they think it's worth.
Fair. So what do you think marketers and brands and business leaders need to learn and concentrate on the most as they start thinking about learning behavioral science? What's a good place that you think that people should start implementing a lot of this?
Sure. I think that it's important at the beginning to have a baseline to say the data, the surveys are a fantastic foundation, but that's not necessarily going to reveal what people's behavior will actually be. When we look at the field of incentives and motivation, a great example is if you ask people at a company, would you like a $10,000 bonus or a trip for 4 to Hawaii for your family that maybe, let's say, costs $7,000? People almost always say, I want $10,000. But their behavior, how much they work hard to achieve that goal, indicates that they actually value that trip a lot more. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of reasons why, I won't get too in the weeds, but the point being their survey answers don't match their behavior. So at a bottom line for people, marketers and designers of programs, is to, when you get your survey data, you get any kind of data, stop and at least take a moment and say, okay, this is great, but what does this really mean in terms of future behavior? What they say they want to do, are they showing that behavior? And if there's a disconnect, then you start digging into the reasons why, the psychology. There's a ton of principles in behavioral science that apply. We mentioned a few, pain and pain, relativity, et cetera. Really drilling down as specific as you can to the problem you want to solve, right? 40-year-old males don't buy life insurance after 10 o'clock. Whatever it is. Yeah. Drill down as specific as you can. Then you can look and say, okay, what's the behavior that I want? What are the barriers to that behavior? And how can I reduce those barriers? The more specific you get, the better. I should just sort of back up and say, as this field is emerging, there's some concern that people will approach it like it's off-the-shelf solutions, off-the-rack.
Yeah,
it's
absolutely.
not. No. It's all context-driven. You've got to test and pilot and experiment. But if you start to understand your customers or your leads, whatever the term you use, the more you understand who they are and where the problems is in their interaction with you, then you can start to say, okay, here are some potential solutions, and you could hire a behavioral scientist or experiment and test and lead.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, because I thought that was a very powerful point, in particular because so many conferences, they want somebody to come up and give, tips and tricks and hacks, and the idea that you could take behavioral science and think it's a cookie cutter approach cannot succeed, should not succeed, because it's got to be individualized to that person's business and how their customers are actually reacting, as opposed to something to get 3 more likes on Facebook. So,
Yeah.
well, Jeff, it's a special time of the show where I start to ask my closing questions.
Uh-oh.
So my first one is, you're on a shark's perspective. My nickname's Shark. What is your favorite kind of shark and why?
I think my favorite kind of shark is probably a hammerhead shark. Probably a common answer, but I just feel like he's got a backup plan. If being a shark doesn't work, he could be a carpenter.
That's one of the best answers, though. So, Jeff, are you ready for the 5 most interesting and important questions you're going to be asked today?
I am.
All right, number
Not,
1.
But I'll take them anyway.
Number 1, use this several times in your session this morning. Chicken or fish?
Fish.
All right, number 2. Midtown Manhattan or downtown?
Downtown. Well, downtown Manhattan 10 to 15 years ago. Now, maybe.
Yeah. Traffic hasn't been good in Midtown for... It'll never be good in Midtown.
True.
Number 3, Jerry Seinfeld or Larry David?
Oh my God, they're the same, basically. I think Larry David.
Why so? Appreciation of
I,
stand-ups that
don't make it,
that
as
don't
famous
make it.
people.
He still got paid.
Yeah, no, he did fine. That's the thing. We can
And he does a
divert
better
to the
Bernie
entertainment
Sanders
industry. Yeah.
impersonation than Jerry.
Yeah, definitely better Bernie Sanders. There's something, I think, powerful about being behind the scenes. I mean, Seinfeld is one of a very small handful of people that have who he is who he has to be in public.
Yeah.
Larry David, maybe not anymore because after Curb Your Enthusiasm, but in general, like he could come out with some totally different thing he wanted to work on and it could fly. Seinfeld couldn't come out with like a piano concerto.
Right.
Although
right.
Steve Martin did it, right?
Well, that's true.
Anyway.
But he played the banjo before, so.
I would take either one of their careers and
Yes.
only Jerry's hair.
Yeah. Number 4, or what's left of either of it. So number 4, because you brought this one up this morning, Picasso or, it's a good New York question, a character artist. Sorry,
what
if
do you
the
mean
money was the same,
Uh-huh.
if the money was the same, if the price of the artwork was the same, and you could have it done for you, who would you want drawing your picture, Picasso or a character
When you say
artist?
character, you mean like those guys in Times Square that draw like the big head and the little body? I mean, like it's got to be Picasso, but in this case, I feel like that you're challenging. What if I found a character artist and said, "Be better than Picasso"?
See, I would take the character artist because if I had Picasso drawing my pictures, I'd have like 3 eyeballs and oblong head, and Number 5, and the most important question you're going to be asked today is biscuits or cornbread?
Cornbread.
Good man. All right, so Jeff, where do you want people to find out more about you, get a copy of the book, and so on and so forth?
Sure. Well, first, peoplescience.com, and second, Jeff Kreisler. That's Kreisler. That's my website, and my Twitter handle is Jeff Kreisler BS for behavioral science and the other meaning. And just track me down. All that info, books, etc., can be found there. And I'm open for questions and whatever your people want.
Well, thanks for the great keynote this morning, and thanks for being on the Shark's Perspective.
Thanks. I wish sharks made a sound so I could sign off. Like if this was the elephant's perspective, it'd be easy.
You hear the sound of the other thing.
The screaming.
That's in its way, yes.
Exactly. Or the hammerhead
exactly.
building a little underground house.
Exactly. So there was my conversation with Jeff Kreisler, a best-selling author, the editor-in-chief of peoplescience.com, a site devoted to leading the conversation about applied behavioral insights, and he's a former stand-up comedian and performer. Let's take a look at 3 key takeaways from my conversation with him. First, as I said, I always think it's interesting to see what kind of opening keynotes conferences bring in to speak. They often really set the tone. Knowing the conference organizer, I know that he's someone with a background in the lead gen space as well as a fan of behavioral science. Why that's pleasing for me to know is because as someone focused on helping businesses grow, I'm glad to see that a conference devoted to helping businesses bring in more leads also sets the tone with understanding the why behind why we buy. It's a topic I often speak on as well. I'm a big fan of behavioral science. Second, enjoyed how Jeff points out that we should think about why we focus on small decisions as opposed to the larger ones. We discount thousands of dollars extra that we spend on home purchases, cars, hundreds extra on an iPhone, for example. However, we'll spend a lot more time nitpicking and focusing on the little extra bits spent on one type of tomato, per his example, or a gallon of milk than the bigger purchases. His point is that you should run through that uncomfortable thought process like you do with the tomatoes, and do that with bigger purchases as well, but don't stress so much on the smaller items. I agree, and it's another reason why I avoid the grocery store as much as I can. Third, we can't change human nature, but the better you understand the underlying why, you can create conditions that help people get to better outcomes. You likely spend so much time in business trying to convince people of what you think, but wouldn't they react better if you truly understood how they think and what will make them come to you? As I mentioned during the show, a lot of conferences want tips and tricks and hacks and all these kind of things as part of the presentations. And behavioral science does have plenty of actionable takeaways that you can learn in sessions. However, understand that, especially to be with behavioral science, this shouldn't be looked at as a cookie cutter approach, because even though human nature is fairly consistent, a lot of the behaviors people exhibit differ depending on the environment, i.e. your website, the ads they see, etc. Just dive deeper. What behavioral science does so well is that it helps you better understand the why. So make sure you devote as much time to understanding that as possible. Got a question? Send me an email to kenneth@asharksperspective.com. Thank you again for the privilege of your time. And here's a behavioral science tip for you. Don't FOMO over missing out on the next podcast. Just join us on the next episode of A Shark's Perspective.